What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to FandomWire. My name is Anthony A. Perez, and today we're going to be touching on Darth Vader, also known as Anakin Skywalker. And here in this video, I want to touch on why he's not only one of the best villains of all time, but why he's one of the best and most complex characters that has ever been made. Of course, to do that, we have to go all the way back to the original film that he was introduced in, which is 1977 Star Wars, of course written and directed by George Lucas. And if you've ever known any of the behind-the-scenes stuff on how that movie was made, it was a nightmare in a lot of ways for George Lucas to get that off the ground, to get a studio to back him, to say yes to that movie. And when he finally did, it created one of the greatest franchises of all time, my personal favorite, of course, Star Wars. And in that original film, when you look at that original concept art by Ralph McQuarrie, you look at the rest of the team and all the iconic characters that were introduced in that original film outside of Darth Vader, like Luke Skywalker, Han Solo, Chewbacca, Obi-Wan Kenobi, Princess Leia, C-3PO, R2-D2, and so many more. It is absolutely incredible to see the legacy that Star Wars has continued to have over decades and decades, even when it continues to be a divisive franchise for many. And when it comes to Darth Vader, it's one of those characters that is not very divisive for a lot of people because most people love him. Like I mentioned before, he's usually a frontrunner for one of the best villains of all time. But one of my favorite things about Darth Vader is how complex his character is, and I love the various chapters that we've been able to see over decades of storytelling in movies, TV shows, books, comics, video games. I mean, you name it. There is so much content that features this character. And while this video isn't going to be a play-by-play of everything that happens in his life, I just kind of want to touch on all of the key moments and why this character is just so beloved by so many people. Going to that 1977 film, it's absolutely incredible right out of the gate when you were introduced to this character. You recognize that he's imposing. You have David Prowse in the suit, the late great David Prowse, with James Earl Jones giving us that iconic voice that we all know and love today. And it's absolutely awesome to see the blend of a great physical actor and the voice that just brings so much to a character. And it has to be one of the best examples of having two different actors play the same character and bringing them to life in such a beautiful and vivid way and creating one of the most imposing villains of all time. Now, one of the coolest things about that first film, though, is that they set up a lot about his character without him having really an abundance to do. It isn't until the latter half of the film, since he's not the central character, that we get to see a lot more of him around the Death Star, most notably that fantastic fight between him and Ben Kenobi. And while that's not necessarily the greatest fight by today's standards, it had such a great sense of stakes at the time and created some of the most iconic dialogue between characters in all of Star Wars. And I think one of the greatest decisions that George Lucas ever made in that film was keeping Darth Vader alive. But the reality is, we know that George Lucas didn't have everything planned out at this point because it was already a nightmare to get this movie off the ground, and he had no idea that it was going to become an absolute huge phenomenon, a worldwide blockbuster that was going to completely change the scope of cinema moving forward. Blockbusters would never be the same because of this movie. And so I think it's such an incredible decision that George Lucas made on his end to just have Darth Vader drift off at the end of that Death Star battle into space so that he could return in the next film, and my personal favorite film in the Star Wars franchise, The Empire Strikes Back, which came out in 1980. And this film for me is still my favorite Star Wars movie of all time. While there have been Star Wars installments that have done really great things when it comes to action and cinematography, musical score, as well as just over-the-top visuals and CGI and all these different technological advancements, what I love about this film is it takes everything that the original film was, doubles down on it, the lore, the world building, the characters, and gives us so much more of it, while also teeing up a fantastic finale to this original trilogy. And Darth Vader gets the opportunity to be a far bigger presence in that second film. We're also introduced to his master, Emperor Palpatine, in a brief scene, and throughout the course of the film, he is this looming threat that is following behind our heroes from the first film, and most notably is one step ahead, which leads us to one of the most iconic sequences in all of Star Wars, which takes place on the planet of Bespin in a little city known as Cloud City. This, of course, would lead to the iconic "I am your father" scene. Of course, one of the biggest spoilers of all time at that time. It completely just shook the ground. And even if you look into the behind the scenes of that whole sequence, a lot of the people who were involved in the movie didn't even know. George Lucas told a few small amount of people, with Mark Hamill finding out pretty much right before they were going to shoot, which is an absolutely fantastic thing, to keep it a surprise not only from the audiences but also from the people who made the film, to allow them to be surprised even by the thing that they are currently making. And between the fantastic lightsaber battle and dialogue between Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader, there's just so many fantastic moments with Vader Vader in this movie. The look, the feel, the vibe, he's imposing, he's menacing, he is a threat. There are fantastic just small lines of dialogue between him and Lando Calrissian that really just showcase how scary this guy is, because in the first film he is an imposing threat. You do recognize how this guy is dangerous, but the second film does everything from cinematography to musical score to the look of the character, the upgrade of the design of the character, and just a fantastic story that really makes this character scary and leads you into the third film with worry for where our characters are going to go from here. And that of course leads to the big finale, Return of the Jedi, where again Darth Vader is a big threat, but most notably there's a fantastic father-son narrative here, and you learn a lot more in this film about how the dark side works. One of my favorite things about Star Wars is how the Force works, the idea that all living beings have the Force, with only a certain amount of people having the ability to tap into that Force and actually use it. And of course, if you allow it to corrupt you, the dark side can be something that allows you to be fueled by pain, anger, misery, and all these other dark and negative emotions, and it can be something that helps you for a while, but if you allow it to corrupt you for too long, it can take over who you are, even if you don't want that to be the case. And we learn in this film, Return of the Jedi, that Vader is almost a slave to the dark side. Here's this character who's so imposing, that's strong, that can use the dark side to completely overtake anyone around him. But ultimately in this film, we realize he has a soft spot for his son and how the dark side is controlling him in these moments. And there's this fear of his master, Palpatine, really just showcases in this film. We're able to see him struggling with the idea that he has to live up to this potential. He has to live up to what Palpatine wants, and he's afraid to fight that. And over the course of the film, of course, he ends up eventually siding with his son, protecting his son. He saves the day. This is why I feel he's still the chosen one. Some people would say that's not the case and that the sequel trilogy unraveled that, but I think that this moment really showcases how Anakin Skywalker truly was the chosen one, even though he did become Darth Vader when of course he destroys Palpatine and sacrifices his own life. And while David Prowse was known for being the individual who was in the suit for all of the filming of the character, when it came down to the scene where they were going to remove his helmet and he was going to have a nice touching moment between him and his son, Sebastian Shaw was actually the character who was cast to take over the role for that brief moment, as well as at the very end of Return of the Jedi when we see the Force ghosts of him, Ben Kenobi, and Yoda, which of course now has been completely changed to Hayden Christensen's iteration of the character, who we'll get into in just a little bit. This broke the heart of David Prowse, who has spoken on this on many occasions, that he wasn't able to be the face of Vader when they took off the helmet, though I do love seeing Sebastian Shaw in that role, but I also am incredibly nostalgic. And this right here to me is one of the most beautiful endings to any story. I mean, being able to see this character who's masked and is villainous and threatening over the course of 2 films, and in the final film start to realize that even though he is still this threat, he still is this menace to our main characters, we start to really unravel that the dark side has corrupted him. And when he takes his helmet off in this moment, you have this old withered man under there who is just happy to lay his eyes on his son for the first real time, and has recognized that he's made horrible decisions over the course of his life and is now trying to do the right thing, even if it does mean his own life, and no ability to really reconcile that relationship with him and his son. It's one of the most fantastic endings to any trilogy, and even though I am a fan of what they did with a lot of things in the Star Wars sequel trilogy, it goes without saying that this for me is the perfect ending to Star Wars that in a lot of ways should have stayed that way. Now, I was about 6 years old when the first prequel film, The Phantom Menace, came out in 1999, where we're introduced to Anakin Skywalker as a young boy around the age of 10, played by Jake Lloyd, who unfortunately would go on to receive so much hate for the role, which breaks my heart because I've always been a ginormous fan of Jake Lloyd because he's also in my favorite Christmas movie of all time, Jingle All the Way, and I always loved him in this role as Anakin. I think that he really showcases for me the tragedy of Darth Vader, which is really what George Lucas was trying to get across with those prequel films. Here you have this young boy who is essentially conceived immaculately. He's living with his mother Shmi Skywalker on the sand planet of Tatooine, and when we first meet him, he is a young boy who is a slave to this character named Watto, and eventually ends up getting saved by the Jedi Knight Qui-Gon Jinn, of course played by Liam Neeson. This leads unfortunately to the death of Liam Neeson, eventually to Darth Maul, and now Anakin is going to be trained by Obi-Wan Kenobi, who of course we know they end up going toe-to-toe in A New Hope, as we mentioned before, the original film from 1977, in that fight that doesn't necessarily hold up a lot when it comes to choreography these days, but ultimately definitely still has a lot of significance because of the events of these prequel films. And I love what they did with Jake Lloyd in this film. There's so many great moments with this character where we really get to see his heart. And while there are elements of his performance that feel like a child actor very much so, I really just love some of the small key moments, like when Anakin looks to his mother when she's not willing to necessarily help Qui-Gon and the gang get off of Tatooine, and says that you always say that the biggest problem in the universe, in the galaxy, is the fact that nobody helps each other, and essentially pushes his mother to recognize that it's his opportunity now to help other people. And I love seeing that in the character that will go on to be one of the biggest villains of all time, because it really does showcase the tragedy of this really pure soul who is in a very dark situation already. He's a slave, and he's still loving and kind to the people around him. And I love seeing Anakin in that pod racing sequence in The Phantom Menace. While that film has a lot going on and can be a little bit messy narratively at times, I think when it really comes down to the Anakin Skywalker stuff, they really nailed setting up how messed up his life was, but how pure he was throughout all this, and how he was in a lot of ways a perfect candidate to become a Jedi, even if he was a little too old, as the Jedi Council does say. Now, of course, I'm paraphrasing with a lot of this because there's so much story and we'd be here for hours if I touched on every little detail, but at the end of The Phantom Menace, he is now being trained as a Jedi by his new master, Obi-Wan Kenobi, played of course beautifully by Ewan McGregor throughout the prequels, who would also return, and Obi-Wan Kenobi the series later on, which we'll touch on in just a moment as well. Which moves us now to Attack of the Clones, which is a film that I remember going to see in theaters and absolutely loving. It's a film that tends to be the one that most people crap on. I do agree there are some issues with dialogue at times in this film, and there is a bit of a messy narrative that kind of connects some pieces at times, but I love this film, and I will always remember the iconic just moment of seeing Yoda whip out his lightsaber at the end to fight Count Dooku, and just hearing the theater that I was in erupt. But we're not here to talk about Yoda, we're here to talk about Anakin Skywalker, and in this film, this was the introduction of Hayden Christensen taking over the role of Anakin Skywalker, and I always loved him. And mind you, I was a kid when these films came out. I was the target demographic in a lot of ways for these films. A lot of people hated Jar Jar. I didn't. I don't necessarily think he's the greatest Star Wars character, but I do have a lot of love for him and the actor Ahmed Best. So yeah, you know, I really just loved Hayden Christensen in this role as Anakin initially. There are some moments when I go back and revisit it where the performance isn't beautiful, and I think that has a little bit more to do with George Lucas as well as some of the dialogue that he was given. But this is the film where we really get to see Anakin shifting from this sweet young boy to a character that can be a little bit malicious at times, a little bit selfish, and clearly has some anger issues. And after we end up finding out there's an assassination attempt on the person he of course loves, Padme, who we met in the first film, played once again by Natalie Portman, he is now assigned to protect her, and amidst all this ends up kind of bringing her along in an adventure where he has a fear that his mother isn't in danger, and of course she is, and ends up dying in his arms due to the Tusken Raiders, the Sand People, and he ends up killing all of them. But not only the men, but the women and the children too. He slaughtered them. He slaughtered them like animals because they are animals. I didn't necessarily quote that perfectly, but that's the basic gist. This is also the film where we learn that he hates sand, and it's rough and it's coarse and it gets everywhere. And if that doesn't add more complexity to the character, I don't know what else does. And while I am joking here, I do love that this film allows us to kind of see a kind of more edgy, teenage, angsty iteration of the character, you know, and that tends to happen in life. I think that when people dog on this version of Vader, I actually think it's a very human version of the character, because you have this guy who was super sweet in the first film. He's a young kid, and we know he's going to become one of the darkest villains of all time. But in this film, he's in that in-between phase where he's, you know, starting to grow up and he's starting to have his own opinions on things. He feels a little bit more cocky in his abilities, and that leads to him kind of having a messed up idea of how to be in a lot of situations. Some of his social situations are a little bit awkward and uncomfortable, and I think that this film tackles a lot of that really, really well. Of course, the film ends up leading to a fantastic, ginormous arena battle between battle droids and Geonosians and Jedi, and of course leads to Anakin and Padme professing their love for one another, even though they've had some awkward scenes in the movie, and of course having a secret marriage behind the backs of the various politicians that Padme knows, and of course most notably the Jedi Temple. And then of course one of the greatest Star Wars films of all time, Star Wars Revenge of the Sith, the third installment in the prequels and the third one chronologically. This film for me is still to this day one of the greatest cinematic experiences I've ever had. Everybody knew this was the film where Anakin Skywalker was going to become Darth Vader. And this is the film for me where Hayden Christensen feels so comfortable in the role. I mean, I just love the sequences with Hayden Christensen as Darth Vader in this film. There's so many fantastic sequences of him as Anakin Skywalker here. Again, he's become more confident as a Jedi, and he's had the ability to mature a little bit more. He's no longer as angsty and as kind of silly as he was in the last film, but he still has these things that get in the way from him really being the full-on Jedi that he can be. Of course, he's ultimately manipulated by Palpatine over the course of this film, who would eventually become his master because he believes that his love, Padme, is gonna die in childbirth because he's just learned that she's pregnant with his two kids, of course, Luke and Leia. This leads him down a dark path that Padme cannot follow because he thinks there's some sort of way through the dark side that he is able to, of course, save Padme. And of course, siding with Palpatine leads to Order 66, where the Jedi are murdered and Anakin decides to just start murdering young children, which is absolutely insane. I do always feel like that's a fairly abrupt turn for his character, but is honestly one of the most iconic scenes in this film. And by the end of this film, we see a man who has to fight his best friend, his mentor, his master in a broken-hearted way. The hate consumes who he is. He ends up having the rest of his limbs that are not already robotic cut off. He ends up getting burnt by lava, and I love the sequence where we get to see Padme giving birth as well as Anakin being turned into Vader. You have the death of Padme and the birth of their children while also having the birth of Darth Vader, and there's so much pain, agony, and fear on his face. You recognize that he is just a slave to what's going on. He's been manipulated, and now he's too far gone to do anything. He learns that Padme is dead, and of course this completely destroys his heart. But thankfully, Revenge of the Sith wasn't the end of Anakin Skywalker's story, as in 2008 an animated 3D series was introduced called The Clone Wars. Of course, The Clone Wars was originally mentioned in the original 1977 film, and of course takes place in between the events of Star Wars Attack of the Clones as well as Revenge of the Sith. And this would end up going on for 5 seasons, as well as a 6th season called The Lost Missions, which is essentially a culmination of episodes that would have made up another season. And yeah, we get to spend more time with Anakin Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi during the events of the Clone Wars, and we're introduced to one of the most iconic characters and one of the most integral characters to the character of Anakin Skywalker, Ahsoka Tano, who grew on most fans as she started off as this annoying Padawan to Anakin and grew to be one of the greatest Jedi characters that has ever graced the screen. And maybe one of these days we'll have to go ahead and do a video here on Ahsoka. But in 2012, everything changed when Disney acquired Lucasfilm from George Lucas, and the future of Star Wars was completely unclear. We knew we were going to be getting a whole lot of movies, but the biggest thing that probably broke the hearts of most fans was learning that all of the books and comics that had been released throughout the years of the original trilogy, the prequels, and up to 2012 would no longer be considered canon and now are considered legends, alternate universe, and that a new canon would be built. As movies would start to roll out, while Darth Vader didn't appear in the first film that was released, The Force Awakens, his spirit is very much there through the character of Kylo Ren, his grandson, who is of course Ben Solo, played by Adam Driver, the son of Han Solo, as well as Princess Leia. While he's not in the film physically, we do get to see his melted helmet at a certain sequence of the film, which allows his presence to be very much felt. Not much longer after that though, Rogue One, a Star Wars story, would come out, which was the first of the anthology Star Wars films that tied directly into the events of the 1977 Star Wars and featured a whole new set of characters that were essentially a Suicide Squad, if you catch my meaning. Darth Vader though gets to appear in certain moments in the film, giving us one of the most iconic action sequences that is one of the most haunting Star Wars scenes of all time at the very end of the movie. And even with Darth Vader having died decades ago and having prequels on his character and books and comics, they would continue Darth Vader's stories and his introductions into various stories throughout the course of time. He's also gone on to appear, like I mentioned before, in that final season of the Clone Wars that Disney gave us. He also appears in Star Wars Rebels as essentially a leader to the Inquisitors, who are Jedi hunters for the Empire. We get to see him in some pretty significant sequences. We also get to see him at Obi-Wan Kenobi, and one of the greatest things about Obi-Wan Kenobi and Rebels is that they share a very similar sequence where Obi-Wan Kenobi, his master, gets to face off against Darth Vader, and Ahsoka gets to face off against Darth Vader in Star Wars Rebels Season 2 finale. And both Ahsoka and Obi-Wan share a very similar scene with Anakin in this moment, where they each slice off a different side of his helmet, and they share very similar lines of dialogue with one another, which continues on what George Lucas loves to do with Star Wars, which is that it rhymes like poetry, and that the various installments have elements about them that rhyme with one another. And while we've talked about the rise and fall of the character, I think one of the greatest things that we're seeing today is the rise again of the character. We already know that he saved his son, he saved the galaxy at the very end of Return of the Jedi, and showed us that he was in fact the chosen one, the prophesized young boy that was going to completely save the galaxy. He did save the galaxy for many, many years. But what I love about what they're doing with the character now is that he reappears in Ahsoka, a sequel series to Star Wars Rebels, and of course a continuation to the story of Ahsoka Tano, this time around played by Rosario Dawson, who originally appears as the character in The Mandalorian. And when we get to see him in Ahsoka, he kind of shows up as this Force ghost who's meant to challenge and test his old Padawan, giving her one final big lesson. And at the very end of the season, when she's learned the lesson that she needs to learn, we get to see this fantastic moment where he looks onto her as a proud master. And I think that Hayden Christensen clearly has only grown even more strong with this role, and gives us some of the greatest Anakin Skywalker and Darth Vader moments of all time in Obi-Wan Kenobi as well as in Ahsoka. The character of Darth Vader is going nowhere, and I love the fact that he's a character that died so long ago but ultimately has been so integral to Star Wars storytelling for so many years, and they do so many great things to keep him engaging, exciting, complex, and diverse. He's a character that's been menacing, threatening, and scary. He's a character that's been broken. He's a character that's been sweet and tender and kind. And all of these things come together to create one of the most complex characters across the board, one of the greatest villains of all time, and honestly, in my personal opinion, the greatest character of all time. And I want to hear what you guys have to say down below. Who's your favorite Star Wars character? Who's your favorite villain in the Star Wars universe? Who's your favorite character of all time? Whatever the case may be, leave any and all comments down below, and we can't wait to hear what you guys have to say here at FandomWire. So we'll see you guys in the next one. Bye-bye.